Albert Einstein, through no sort of intentional action on his part, sort of ruined an entire genre of science fiction. Specifically, the kind of galaxy-wide civilization kind of story. See, he published his theory of relativity in 1905, but in 1937, Edward Elmer Smith published his book Galactic Patrol, in which it was the first example in fiction of a galaxy-spanning civilization. But the interesting thing is, there is no sort of FTL. Obviously, you can go faster than light, but it's not the kind of impressive technological barrier that it is in a post-relativity world. And it might seem odd that this is about 30 years after relativity that this book is published, but the USSR collapsed 30 years ago, and modern science fiction still includes Russia or the Soviet Union in some kind of, maybe not a primary role, but definitely a background role. It's kind of assumed that the languages that people speak are English or Russian, though in more modern books, Chinese is actually starting to turn up. Funnily enough, the first book I remember doing this is The Martian. So what's happened now is, as time has progressed, Smith wrote this book only 30 years after relativity, so it was still kind of acceptable as we'll use an older technique. But relativity is now more than 100 years old, and no modern science fiction is based in a world where that makes sense to make that choice. So what you end up with now is this difficult decision with, do you break the speed of light or do you not? And if you do, you need to make a good explanation for this. And typically, the best explanation for this is it's an alien technology, or they just don't talk about it at all. Ironically, Star Trek has more in common with the Lensman series than it does modern science fiction, because yes, it has this idea of it's being realistic, and the warp field is a plausible, realistic method of travelling faster than light. But funny enough, subspace allows for instant communications across the entire galaxy, which is exactly how the ether works in the Lensman books. You see, the ether is the theory before general relativity as to how does light travel through a vacuum, because they understood light to be a wave rather than a particle, but a wave has to travel through a medium, and the theory was what was called the luminiferous ether. And of course there were plenty of experiments before this time where they were trying to measure the wake of Earth through because there was the assumption that it was a universal still, and you'd have an absolute speed, and they were trying to measure Earth's sort of speed through the ether. Of course, they never found anything because that's not how the universe seems to work. The interesting point is when they go for alien technology, because showing an FTL drive for an alien ship actually is a great immediate example of an advancement in that society, because it's not just that FTL exists. We don't think it is possible under our current understanding of physics. It's like taking a steam engine back to the ancient Greeks before the invention of the helipile.
First, we thought we could reverse engineer their technology, but we were like Cro-Magnons trying to rebuild an airplane when we hadn't even discovered fire.
However, a far more interesting example is when an author decides not to break the speed of light. But the interesting thing is that sort of inherently restricts you, but surely a restriction is in fact an advantage when it comes to a creative endeavour. For example, Alastair Reynolds' Revelation Space series. That's not this book, this is the second one. I don't have that book with me at the moment. In fact, the human society is sort of strung between... one character goes on a prospective distance of about 100 light years, and that's considered quite far out there. In fact, the events of Revelation Space, the book, are set around a star called Delta Pavonis, which is just under 20 light years away, and it's considered something of a backwater in the middle of nowhere. So what you end up with is a civilization that's less than 50 light years across. It's sort of fairly restricting, but even then there's plenty of sort of options and planets for stories to be told. But the other thing about that is you don't have a cohesive civilization, because you cannot maintain law and order across that kind of thing. If it takes 50 years for something to cross from one side to the other, that's, they have life extension technologies and they have cryogenic freezing in Revelation space. But that's still time that passes. That's almost, modern understanding a generation is about 25 years. That's 2 generations of people. Culture changes in that time, and so orders that may have been sent from a commander, and then by the time they arrive, they might not be relevant anymore. So what you'll actually end up with is a sort of semi-disconnected civilization, where the civilization is more defined by the values and the ways that people live rather than any kind of overarching government system. And this actually has precedent in the real world. A lot of old empires that we understand, so sort of the older Chinese empires, the Roman Empire, or that kind of era, we have this understanding of like a cohesive empire, but realistically they were fairly broken down by local governors, and the local governors would have been essentially had free reign for the most part over their jurisdictions. And of course this differs from empire to empire, from region to region, over history and all that. You don't really get a kind of cohesive civilization until the British Empire, and they're sort of the first ones that actually could send a message to anywhere in less than a year with steam engines and steam ships and that kind of stuff. But interestingly, that only has limits. If the planet Earth was bigger, you'd have to go even faster before you reach that point. If you're on a Dyson sphere, on the inside of a Dyson sphere, that is an impossibly massive distance. You wouldn't really be able to deal with that. Even if you had high-speed rail, it would still take you years to traverse from one side to the other. In fact, maybe not even a cohesive empire type, but something a bit more like the Celts of ancient Europe, where really they were only defined by the kind of way of life, and changes spread very, very slowly through them. I think a really, really good example of this kind of galactic civilization, but not really a cohesive civilization, is found in House of Suns, another book by Alastair Reynolds. This is actually one of his best by most people's reckoning. It is phenomenal, and the whole background of this story is that there's what is called turnover, and essentially so the book follows what's called shatterlings, who essentially travel very close to the speed of light all the time. So there's a journey in the book toward the end where they travel for 60,000 years, so close to the speed of light, and the main character is put into stasis that time as well, so they don't age. So what happens is civilizations come and go. That's the turnover, and the shatterlings in the story are there to document and record the histories of the civilizations that they do meet. But at the end of that book, there is one of the main characters has a musing of, maybe this isn't how it is always supposed to be, because the shatterlings come from what was called the Golden Hour, which is where all of humanity was in a single solar system, and everyone was within one light hour of everyone else. So you couldn't be out of communications for that long. But the shatterlings were an invention that took humanity out of that environment into this kind of galactic turnover situation. But the musing at this end of the book is saying that maybe this isn't the only way to do it. Perhaps we're still learning how to do this as a galactic civilization. But I suppose it's interesting that actually more modern science fiction has tended to push away from this kind of galactic civilization thing. If we're thinking about this kind of civilization, you basically end up with the Empire from Star Wars, and that's about it. Star Trek Starfleet doesn't have the whole galaxy. The Dune Saga also isn't across many planets at all. I don't think it's particularly very big in the lore. Firefly is a great example. It's actually never explicitly mentioned until the intro to Serenity, the movie. But actually, they're all in one solar system. And it works completely fine. There's only 14 planets, but plenty of stations and asteroids and all that kind of stuff. But you don't need a civilization. And in fact, perhaps it's kind of the issues that have been cropping up, in that in Attack of the Clones, Obi-Wan is told that there are 200,000 clones, with 1 million more well on the way as the line goes. But what's really interesting is in the culminating battle at the end of The Princess of Mars, a single city has an army of 1 million. And so the scales of dealing with a civilization of that size, people don't really know how many zeros to put at the end of their numbers. You know, if a lot of Star Wars's numbers only really make sense if you assume that most planets are barely habited at all. You know, planets only having a few tens of thousands of people. Well, that's basically nothing compared to the 7 billion that actually exists on this planet. So I guess my point is that the sort of cornerstones of the space opera genre, the galactic civilizations, the empires, isn't really something that is possible for a modern audience to really comprehend. Perhaps as relativity gets more and more established in sort of the present mind of the audience of readers, that maybe we've seen the end of a galactic empire, because as FTL becomes more and more of a gimmick, it becomes less and less significant. If your setting has FTL just so you can have more planets, that doesn't really mean that you need to have it. You can just have more planets. You can change your timelines, that kind of stuff. So yes, that's my long-winded rant about faster than light travel in science fiction. And of course, FTL is really just the flavour text to the background of the actual story, which is the most important part. So long as it stays consistent, if you put at least a tiny bit of thought into it, it's really not going to affect the story that much at all.